Today, we're talking about a mercenary army so successful, so brutal, and so unbelievably feared that their legend has echoed for over 700 years. This is the absolutely wild story of the Catalan Company.
All right, so just look at this scene. You've got this legendary warrior, Roger de Flor, arriving in Constantinople like a rock star. I mean, he and his men were hired to be the Byzantine Empire's last hope. But this grand arrival, it's really just the beginning of a much, much darker story. One filled with ambition, betrayal, and a thirst for revenge so terrible it would be remembered for centuries.
So where did this incredible band of soldiers even come from? Well, our story kicks off right at the dawn of the 14th century, with the end of one very long, very bloody war, which, it turns out, was just the beginning of their own.
The year is 1302, and a peace treaty has just ended the War of the Sicilian Vespers. Now, that's great news for the diplomats, but it creates this massive problem. You suddenly have thousands of elite, battle-hardened soldiers with no war to fight, and more importantly, no one to pay them. And a continent flooded with unemployed, highly skilled warriors is, well, it's a recipe for absolute chaos.
And we're not talking about just any soldiers here. A lot of these guys were Almogavars. These men were forged in the centuries-long wars of the Reconquista in Spain. Think of them as some of the toughest light infantry in the entire world. They were masters of the ambush, incredibly tough, and just lethally effective.
So who needs an army like this? Well, way out east, the once mighty Byzantine Empire is crumbling. It's being overrun by Turkish forces in Anatolia, what's now modern-day Turkey. So in a moment of sheer desperation, the emperor, Andronicos II, makes an offer to a fascinating character named Roger de Flor, a former Knights Templar turned mercenary commander. The deal was simple: bring your army of Almogavars and save my empire.
And the welcome they get in January 1303 is just, it's over the top. Roger de Flor shows up with about 8,000 men. Right away, he's given the incredible title of Megas Dux, which basically means commander-in-chief of all the imperial forces. Not only that, he gets to marry the emperor's own 15-year-old niece. But all this favoritism immediately causes trouble. The powerful Genoese merchants, who pretty much ran the city's trade, didn't see saviors, they saw rivals. And yeah, bloodshed followed almost immediately.
But, political drama in the capital, that was the least of the Turkish forces' problems. Because once the Catalan Company was finally unleashed in Anatolia, they proved to be an absolutely, completely unstoppable force.
I mean, their track record over the next year or so is just mind-blowing. In October 1303, they launch a surprise attack at Cyzicus, and it's a total rout. Then, through 1304, they just keep winning, smashing armies at Gurme, saving the city of Philadelphia at the Battle of Aulax, and then they pull off their most legendary victory of all.
If you want to understand just how good these guys were, look no further than the Battle of Cabistra. The company has maybe 7,000 soldiers. They're facing a Turkish army of 30,000. 30,000! The result? A decisive victory for the Catalans. They killed over 18,000 enemy soldiers. They didn't just win, they completely annihilated their opponents.
You have to imagine this. Before a battle, the Almogavars had this chilling ritual. They'd stand in the dark and start striking their swords and spears against the ground, against the rocks, creating this shower of sparks, all while chanting in unison their terrifying war cry, "Awake Iron, awake!" It was a promise of the violence that was about to be unleashed.
So, they had done it. They did everything the emperor had asked of them, and more. They had saved the empire from what looked like certain collapse. And their reward for all of this was betrayal. And here's the fatal flaw in the emperor's plan. The Catalan Company was just too good at its job. This is the classic problem when you hire mercenaries, right? What happens when the tool you've hired becomes more powerful than you are? Roger de Flor was acting like he owned Anatolia, and the court back in Constantinople got terrified. It was like they'd hired a pack of wolves to guard the sheep, and now they realized they couldn't control the wolves.
And so, on April 30th, 1305, all that fear boiled over into an act of unbelievable treachery.
Roger de Flor and more than 1,000 of his men are at a feast. They're guests of the emperor's own son, Michael. They're unarmed, they're celebrating, and they're completely ambushed. On Michael's signal, allied mercenaries swarm in and slaughter them all. The hero who saved the empire was murdered by the very people who hired him.
The emperor's son probably thought he had cut the head off the snake. Oh, he was so wrong. All he'd done was make it impossibly, unbelievably angry.
What came next was one of history's most brutal campaigns of pure revenge.
So when the rest of the company heard what happened, they didn't scatter. They didn't surrender. They did something completely insane. This small, leaderless mercenary army, deep inside enemy territory, formally declared war on the entire Byzantine Empire.
What followed is known today as the Catalan Vengeance. For 2 solid years, they marched across the empire's heartland of Thrace, and they burned everything. They looted, they killed. They weren't just getting revenge. They were systematically tearing the empire apart, leaving a scar that would weaken Byzantium for decades.
And if you want a perfect example of the kind of pure terror they inspired, get this. The monks on the holy mountain of Mount Athos were so horrified by what the company did that they issued a formal ban, prohibiting anyone from the region of Catalonia from ever setting foot there again. A ban that stayed in place until the year 2000, almost 700 years later.
After 2 years, they had bled Thrace completely dry. The company needed a new purpose and a new payroll. And this brings us to the final, and maybe the most unbelievable chapter in their entire story.
They marched south into Greece, which was ruled by French lords at the time. And with their reputation, it didn't take long for them to find a new job. They were hired by a man named Walter V of Brienne, the French Duke of Athens. He needed them to clear out some of his own enemies.
And you're not going to believe it, but history repeats itself. The company, as always, does its job with terrifying efficiency. But then the Duke, feeling pretty confident with his own army of 700 elite French knights, decides to double-cross them and hold back their pay. This turned out to be a fatal mistake. At the Battle of Halmiros, the Catalan Company didn't just defeat the Duke's army, they wiped it off the face of the earth, killing Walter and nearly every single one of his knights.
So now, the Duke is dead. His entire army is gone. The Duchy of Athens is completely defenseless. And the company, having been betrayed by powerful rulers not once but twice, basically just said, you know what? We're done working for other people. So they took it. They just seized the entire duchy for themselves. The soldiers for hire were now the lords of the land.
And this wasn't some short-lived victory either. The Catalan Company set up its own state. They ruled the duchies of Athens and Neopatris for nearly 80 years. They created this bizarre Catalan-speaking island in a Greek and French sea, a rogue state born from blood and betrayal.
So, what do you even make of a story like that? Were they heroes who saved an empire? Were they villains who left a trail of terror everywhere they went? Or were they just the ultimate survivors in a brutal, violent age? The story of the Catalan Company is a wild ride, but it's also a stark reminder that sometimes the deadliest force on the board answers to absolutely no one.